Um, so thanks again, Susan, for inviting me to speak. And I do really think it's wonderful that we're all gathering here to talk, get excited about dementia-friendly environments. And it was also very wonderful to hear Sarah present, and she is so wonderfully knowledgeable in this area. There is a little bit of overlap between what I'm going to talk about and what Sarah has talked about, because looking at daylighting and stuff like that is very intertwined with the visual environment. And so, like her, I've included some information about things that might be helpful, but also some of the projects that are being carried out as, as a part of my PhD and other things. So the thing that I wanted to start with is this idea that basically, if we think about the origins of architecture, what we're essentially trying to do is trying to control the environment so that we can optimize it and live the way we want to. And that is no different to dementia-friendly design, where we're essentially trying to create those environments that specifically are enabling also for people living with dementia so that they can keep living the way that they want to. As you would have seen from Sarah's slides, that one of the key things when we're thinking about daylighting, thinking about the visual environment, is thinking about how people living with dementia might process lighting and visual information differently because of the way the brain might process some of the light and visual information, but also there are common eye conditions like cataracts, glaucoma, or just age-related changes to the mechanics of the eye or the brain. So things might look darker, there'll be less contrast, things might look yellower and impacted in other ways. So I'd just like to, reiterate the point that it's really important that we acknowledge that different people will see the world differently because they have different eyes and have different brains. And that is especially true for people living with dementia. So when we're trying to make the environments more suitable for them, that we do have to ask them what is best from their point of view. Okay, so one of the important things to consider is that many people living with dementia will have lower sensitivity to light, so that means they will need more light in areas to see well. Often in guidelines that converts to about double the amount of light of an average adult. Past studies have shown that low lighting conditions are associated with more falls, more potential for visual hallucinations, and less ability to navigate through buildings. But on the other hand, if we're adding more lights, just keep in mind to avoid glare, as Sarah has pointed out, older people and people living with dementia both have more sensitivity to glare, and that's keeping in mind where you're placing your lights, your windows, how that is in their visual field, in your vision, the type of kind of curtains or lampshades that you're using that might make it less, direct and harsh. So that leads to another point to consider is having balanced lighting distribution across the room. So like, what Sarah talked about with the black floor mats, shadows can be also quite confusing. It's a little bit of a balanced thing because you do need shadows in order to have better contrast and depth perception. You can see 3 dimensions and all of that, but if it's so intense, it can be confusing. So one study over here, you can see the figure. In the very shadowed spaces, older people living with dementia did change the way they walk, often walking around them. So keeping in mind very dark spaces might be confusing. They might not be able to see very well. And I've seen that in some of the interviews I've done as well. And then also similarly, very bright spots of light can be confusing. But also thinking about the room and across different rooms, lighting uniformity can be quite important as well. In general, it's easier for us to adapt our vision if the lighting is relatively uniform. So if you think about at nighttime when you suddenly turn on the lights, it takes a while for your eyes to adjust. It's a little bit like that. And that ability to adapt gets more difficult when you're older. So thinking about that to support older people living with dementia is quite important. And so like Sarah has pointed out in more depth than this, but surfaces and lighting kind of work hand in hand, because essentially what we see is light bouncing off surfaces. So similar to shadows, busy patterns, black floors can be confusing, can be seen as a change in level. Having contrasted, like Sarah has already talked about, having contrast is important to highlight things and make things more recognizable. The light reflectance values, that's how bright it appears, is more important than the hue. But one thing to think about as well is, like I said, the interaction between light and surfaces. So if you are having, say, like directional lights or something like that to try and illuminate a space, say the kitchen, so that you can, chop your stuff, and you would often need more lights in those kind of tasks. You have highly reflective workbenches. That means you're creating these things called veiling reflections, so basically spots of glare on the surfaces, and that can be make things a bit difficult to work. And then another property of light to consider is the color. So I'm not necessarily talking about a blue light, red light, or anything like that, but rather, how much of the wavelengths of color each light has. And so what that is going to, because of the interaction between light and surfaces, what that is going to have an impact on is the appearance of the colors. So it's not just the colors of the surfaces that's important, but also the lights they're using to shine on them. And also, in terms of the wavelengths, because of the lower sensitivity to lighting for older people living with dementia, ensuring that there's adequate exposure to cooler wavelengths in the morning can be good to kind of combat some of the sleep fragmentation and alertness things. Sorry, I just lost my sentence. That can happen with older people living with dementia. But beyond all of the biological things, one of the things that is really important to think about, especially when you're dealing with domestic settings, is that things like comfort, social and aesthetic factors of lighting, or things, privacy, feel of the space, often drive decision making, and also the use of things like blinds and lighting controls more than just pure function. So you can't always prioritize what is easiest in terms of safety and vision. Often people will change their spaces mostly based on their social and aesthetic preferences, unless the space is has a task that is highly demanding, like cooking in kitchens will often lead to people turning on their lights. Of course, at night time, you would turn on your lights as well. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that while there are many artificial means to optimize our lighting environments, one very inexpensive and abundant resource we have in New Zealand that meets many of the dementia-friendly lighting criteria is daylight. Daylight is often preferred. It is more comfortable. It gives better color appearance because it has all of the wavelengths. So that means it's also providing the right wavelengths for the time for your biological clocks. It is also bright enough as long as you are not blocking it with things, like your building is designed in such a way that it's letting in the light. And it can have good uniformity if you are not placing furniture, blinds and stuff that are creating huge shadows areas. And there are many ways to alter our lighting environments. So what I have here is kind of a kind of general spectrum of things, from small modifications of the interior to retrofits to bigger major changes on the right. Well, many of you probably already do some of the things on the left, especially, turning on the lights, opening, closing curtains, blinds, maybe less commonly changing the interior surfaces, but also you can arrange furniture so that you are controlling how shadows are being created relative to the light source, whether that's windows or a lamp. Obviously, there is limitations to some of these interior methods when it comes to controlling daylight and how that interacts with the environment. So in the middle here, there are various kind of more architectural solutions. So some buildings might have these things called solar tube, which is these very reflective mirror tubes that bring in sunlight. There are skylights, and then there's these things called light shelves, these horizontal shelves that basically bounce light deeper into the space. And then there are external louvers and awnings and stuff that you can control the light coming in. A lot of these decisions are dependent also on the building typology and also to do with like which orientation, east, west, south, or north, the window is facing, or the building is facing. Many of these would be less feasible for your average homeowner. So one that really do speak to the importance of having good guidelines so that dementia-friendly buildings are built well in the first place, dementia-friendly daylighting, because it is often quite expensive and resource-intensive to retrofit buildings for daylighting. And so I just kind of wanted to point out what does exist in terms of what we can use to guide designing for daylighting. So we do have a range of things, but none of them quite cover what we need in terms of dementia-friendly daylit environments. So we've got the New Zealand Building Code, which is the minimum standard that we have to meet, generally much lower than everything else. We've got things like the Sustainable Building Certification programs like Homestar. They have higher recommendations in terms of daylighting, but a lot of that research that backs that up is to do with office buildings and adult populations. More appropriate are probably the ones on the right side, middle right side, which are the lighting and also design guidelines for older people, people with vision loss, although most of the research is with older people, and then also for people with dementia. But one of the issues is that actually the amount of research which is actually asking older people living with dementia what they think about their lighting experience, which is the type of research you would have in office buildings and stuff like that for other guidelines, is very limited. So that is what I'm trying to address in my PhD, to see if these guidelines actually match what older people living with dementia, our resident experts, experience. And there aren't many studies that look into this sort of thing, so we can't only ask them what their daylighting experience is. What we're also asking them is, are our research methods, the way we're going about this, any good? And we are still recruiting for this project and also for a follow-on project this year. So do contact me if you're interested. And so what we have done so far is we've taken different ways that we can try and talk about daylighting with older people living with dementia, and also different ways that we can measure the space and the lighting in those spaces. For conversations, we focus mostly on using interview methods that has visual prompting. So one of the ways that we're doing this is using this thing called Talking Mat, which is a card sorting activity, which accompanies the conversation and hopefully makes the very technical daylighting topic a little bit more accessible, keeps track of the conversation, and hopefully make it a little bit more fun. We've also developed a prototype kind of photo-taking application so that we can record the lighting in different spaces at different times and have conversations around them. And so essentially what we're trying to do is get the experience and compare that with the measured data. And so once we have the refined research method, we can carry it out on a more larger scale and actually go back and review whether those guidelines I talked about earlier do match up with the experiences of older people living with dementia. Okay, so while we're taking a step back from visual environments and daylighting, there's another project that I just want to add a little bit here, and I'm very excited to share with you about, led by Professor Nari Kurs, who's in this meeting, the director of our Centre for Co-Created Aging. We're a transdisciplinary research centre, and we're all about creating meaningful inquiries with the community that it concerns. And we've been so far diligently growing our community and supported many research projects that are driven by the older people in our communities over the last few years. And from this year, we are looking to develop more accessible and more New Zealand appropriate resources for dementia-friendly design, so that we can make dementia-friendly design as widespread as universal design or sustainable design. And to do this, we need to pull together those who have experience living with dementia, those who are caring for dementia, professionals, building owners, managers, architects, researchers, and support groups. And we've already had the privilege to have some collaborations with Sarah, who you just heard from, and also Caroline from Alzheimer's New Zealand. And what we're seeking at this stage is just to gather a community of interested individuals who might form some sort of advisory group, and we can ask you questions about your experience. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or if you're interested. So that brings me to my last slide. I just have a few points for you to take away, if anything, out of my little spew here. So one of that thing that I wanted to emphasize is that everyone sees the world differently, and dementia can certainly change our perspective. There are things like lighting levels, contrast, glare, shadows, placement of lighting, surfaces that can, affect our well-being and also independence. While there are many little modifications that we can make in the interior, we also need to invest in enduring changes in the way that we're building. And if there's anything that I've said is of particular interest to you, please do reach out and contact me if you just want to have a chat, or if you want to be part of our projects or our growing community. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. So in the comments, we have got a couple of people who have mentioned other resources that may be of interest to people. So Alex has mentioned the Life Mark, and Carol has mentioned the virtual reality tool, the Eddie tool. And so we'll include both those when we send out our list of resources. We'll add those. So those are yet more things that you can explore. So if anybody has any questions, would you like to add them to the chat or put your hand up? We find it a bit hard to see everybody's hands. But just to also say that for both Jane and for Sarah, we've got lots of people saying thank you and how useful those talks have been. So Jane, just while we're waiting to see if anybody would like to type in a question for you or Sarah, I would be interested if you'd like to just give us a little more detail about that idea of the importance of natural daylight in the morning to help set our rhythms and our melatonin.
So there's been a lot of research over the last 20 years that is looking at that, because a lot of older people, but also in particular people with dementia, do have more fragmented sleep. They might have more night restlessness, a lot of sleeping during the day, and all of that. And part of that is that, if you have changes in your eye, like say the yellowing of your lens, also less light going through, but also in your brain, less able to kind of process or soak up, that light information. It takes a bit more to make sure that your body clock is getting set in the morning. So that means exposure to, the kind of bluer wavelengths of light. But of course, you don't have to turn on blue light, because, say, for example, in daylight, sorry, my camera's doing something funny. in daylight there is that spectrum and there's a lot of it. There can be some issues if you are in big residential care buildings and you're not getting a lot of it, because usually the very high amounts of daylights that the high lux levels, the lighting levels, is usually right next to the window. So being outside, making sure that there is enough daylight is quite important. Otherwise, you would have to look at more artificial means. So there are a lot of things coming out now in terms of circadian lighting, because in case buildings don't have enough of that blue wavelength. Sorry, my camera is doing something funny. Yeah.
Sending you into outer space there. Thanks so much, because it's such an important point, because often as we get older, we spend less time outdoors and in sunlight. And actually, because of that, the increasing opacity of our eyes, we need more time. So it's such an important point. And we've also got a question coming in, or from Tasha, or a opportunity just to talk about how these kind of things work when you've got a multi-generational household. Do you find that adds a complexity into different needs, or is this something that actually benefits everybody?
To be honest, that's something that we are interested in. I don't, in my own research, I haven't quite got there, but I think in terms of that project that we're doing coming up this year for dementia design, one of the things we are very interested in finding out is how we can think about the relationship between the care partners, the whānau, and also the person living with dementia, how you balance those needs. There are, sometimes issues with when you say, for example, you're applying all this light visual contrast and all that. There is a sense that some of these things could medicalize the home. So in terms of LifeMark, actually, someone mentioned they do advocate for them, it's mostly physical access and support, but they do advocate for solutions that are developed in such a way that is kind of got a domestic feel. It doesn't feel like you're in a care environment and all of that. In terms of lighting, a lot of that would be enabling some level of individualization. But again, you have to, I think the important thing to recognize here is that the daylighting is mostly controlled by the building. So if you build right, it's much easier for you to adjust your curtains and lighting levels in terms of, the lighting controls and stuff like that. Oh gosh, sorry.
That's great. And there's a question for both Sarah and Jane together, again, a chance to comment about how urgent do you feel that the need is that we do revise our building standards to take into account these needs that you've been talking about for our aging population and for our people living with dementia?
Well, I'll just kick this off and I'll let Sarah answer the question. I do think that actually, in general, our building code is a performance minimum and shouldn't be taken as the state of the art ever. In terms of even, universal design and physical access to buildings, it's not the same standard as LifeMark, and that's why we have these certification programs. Same with Homestar. If you look at sustainability, if you look at lighting, thermal, all of that, it's much higher standard in those certification programs. So in some ways, it's I think it's a bit of a balance in terms of it's kind of a political question in terms of legislating some of these research recommendations as well. But in terms of older people living dementia, there is a lot more research that needs to be done, especially in the sensory environment.